And good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Andrew Bell from the Content Group studio here in Canberra. We're about at the midway point of the Future Drought Fund Science to Practice Forum. We've heard from 6 of the hubs. We've heard from people on the ground all around the country. For the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to hold a forum bringing 3 different people to this virtual table. I'm actually sat at a round table, but it's just me. But around the country, we have 3 participants for a panel discussion, which begins from the simple sounding question, what does a drought resilient future look like? But we'll be taking input from you around the country. By the way, more than 800 people are part of this forum. So thank you so much for your comments, your questions. Keep them coming in, and particularly during this Q&A. And I will try and integrate as many of your questions as I can to our panel. So without further ado, let's meet our panel. 3 members, and we're going to go into something like a Brady Bunch kind of look to see them. First, Bruce Pascoe, who's in East Gippsland. Hello, Bruce, an author and an enterprise professor. There we have Kate Andrews. Dr. Kate Andrews is in Moruya on the New South Wales South Coast, Executive Officer for NRM Regions Australia and Senior Lecturer at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at ANU. And last but by no means least, Liz Peterson. Dr. Liz Peterson is in Perth. She was in Merredin. She had to come back to Perth, but that's the sort of world we're living in. And she is on the FDF Consultative Committee, and she's also an adjunct senior lecturer at UWA, the University of Western Australia. I'm not going to start with the question posed for this forum. What I am going to do is go around the reel, beginning with Kate, just to get some personal reflections on how drought has shaped your experience. In fact, let's call it what it is. How has it shaped your life and how you see the future? Starting with you, Kate.
Right. Well, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Yuin country here in beautiful South Coast New South Wales and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And by the way, very exciting to have Bruce Pascoe on the panel, as well as my colleague Liz. So look, as far as personal experiences, I think like all Australians, I can go back a very long way with regards to drought, but I think I'm going to go back just about 18 months and bring to people's attention the way all of these things are so interconnected. So for us, it was the fires that came through Eastern Australia that were very much a result of a very long-term drought. And I think we could all see it coming. The forests around us, paddocks had never been this dry. And I think for me, it was a horrifying example of the flow-on effect, the domino effect that can happen from droughts, and watching the impact of that drought upon the communities around us, farmers around us, but also the environment. And the environment has not fully recovered. I still see dieback happening that has nothing to do with the fires itself, but is actually to do from the drought. I've also lived in Western Queensland through quite extreme drought and seeing the horrible mental health impact that has upon people when they're dealing with something that's so much beyond their control. So for me, it's pretty much in my bones, I would say, Andy, just as it is for most Australians.
Thanks, Kate. Bruce, over the border into Victoria, for you, how has drought shaped you in the way you live, the way you think, the way you are?
Well, not a great deal, actually. Like Kate, I'm on Yuin country. I'm on the very southern end of Yuin land, and I acknowledge the country and all the old people and those emerging who are doing such a great job in maintaining their culture. The fires of 2019, 2020 affected me deeply. I burnt through the property. We lost quite a lot, but not this house. So to that degree, I'm much more fortunate than 170 other people in Mallacoota, the nearest town. But I've also driven through the east coast of Australia and I've seen the other devastated towns, Cobargo, Mogo, all of those other places that suffered so terribly. And on the farm here at Yumbara, we are growing traditional Aboriginal grain crops and tuber crops, which are all perennial. And because they're Australian crops, they need no fertiliser and no pesticide, but more particularly no water other than what comes naturally to them. And I think sometimes when we talk about drought, we really should be talking about the wrong crops. And coming to a continent and bringing Northern Hemisphere crops to the land and then insisting that the land look after them is not geographically sensible. Now, we're a long way from providing a lot of food off here, but the establishment is done, and we've proven that we can interseed with these crops and harvest and still have the perennial plant. The old people were able to do it, and we're just learning how to. And I think it's so crucial that a proportion of our agricultural lands are given over to perennial plants, because we see the devastation of those dust storms every summer when cultivation for rice and cotton means that we render the earth bare for a period of time. It dries out and the dust blows over to New Zealand and turns their snow pink. This is not a natural system. This is not even a sensible system. We have to rethink that. But also we have to think our rivers, have to think of our rivers and rethink how we use them. And to estimate that you can utilise 100% of water out of a river catchment is not very kind to the river, but it's also not very kind to humans, because the emotional devastation of seeing those riverbeds dry and the fish dead has a psychological impact on rural Australians, and it's not necessary. We can use water better. We can introduce crops that don't need as much of it, and we can regulate the growing of crops such as cotton and rice, which are plants introduced to Australia and which require the equivalent amount of water they had in Europe and Asia. And we have rices in Australia, Australian rices. Some of them grow in sand. Some of them need water, some don't. We've got a sorghum, grows in the Bega Valley, and once again, survives on the rainfall that falls out of the sky. I think there are alternatives and we need to rethink it. But one of the things we have to do first is to ensure that the fires of 2020 don't return. And they're bound to, because on the surrounds of my farm, which is a national park, the regrowth is incredible. The forest has come back. There are patches that look like they may not return very soon, but the majority of the land has returned. So there's a host of wattle, sapling eucalypts, tobacco bush, and other plants that are recovery species. But Aboriginal people in the burning regime would be beginning to control that regrowth, and the historical record shows that Aboriginal people were active participants in the forest and were known to hand pull plants they didn't want. And overall, there were 10 to 12 trees to the acre. And I think that's what we have to get back to. We have to get back to a reasonable forest that is not matchsticks, because literally they become matchsticks. And that's what I witnessed in 2020. I saw forests which were highly dangerous. I counted the number of trees per acre, which was over 300. And when I came back past that same forest on the 1st of January 2020, there was white dust on the ground. We can't return to that forest regime. We have to rethink our commercial forestry, and we also have to rethink our national parks.
Thanks, Bruce. And you've set up there, I think, a number of the topics we're going to be talking about as we go along in the discussion. But to you, Liz, what does drought mean to you? How has it affected you personally?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, personally, I'm not from a farm, so I can't say it's affected me greatly either. We do have a family property, a lifestyle property on the outskirts of Perth, and over the years we've had to dig, it's not on scheme water, so we've had to dig deeper wells just to have water connected and change how we use the land. But then I have spent over the years quite a bit of time at the kitchen table talking with farmers, and you can see the stress that has caused when they're looking up at the sky. We've heard looking up at the sky and looking down at the land and wishing and needing it to rain. And then when it doesn't rain, you can see how people often socially get within themselves. They're not open as much with their partners. It affects their marriages, it affects their children. It then affects the whole community. Then we've got agribusinesses that rely on it. So when the farmers, they've got less production due to drought, then it affects the whole community. So I guess, what does drought resilience mean to me? I guess it means that if we've got a community, a population in rural and regional Australia that are passionate, that love what they're doing, they know they have to change, but when they look up at the sky and look down at the ground and say, I really want it to rain, there's great opportunities from rain, but if it doesn't rain, I'm okay. And if it doesn't rain for a while, I'm okay, and I'm more than okay. I still love what I'm doing. I know what I can do. I've planned for this. It's not going to affect my landscape because I have prepared for it. I know what I can do, so that drought isn't devastating for me. I am still confident. I have joy in life, and when it does rain, then I can make the very most of those opportunities too.
That's the kind of resilience we've heard from a number of hubs talking about the mental health element of resilience. To stay with you, you're an applied economist, and the impact of drought, just to investigate that a little bit more, the economies of rural areas, because of course it's not just properties, it's not just farms. There are lots of urban centres that require an economy which partly comes from the country surrounding them, but also goes back there. From your point of view, as an applied economist, how does drought play, and how can we get past some of the barriers thrown up by drought?
Yeah, I think it's so important, because our whole regional community is about having a thriving community, living in a place where you love living there, and you know that you've got a great hospital within easy driving distance, you've got schools, you've got education systems, you've got shops, you've got somewhere that the whole family enjoys being. So I think it takes, we need to take it, we need to not see the farmers, but all the whole supply chain and the whole the economy as a whole, as you say. I guess as a member of the Future Drought Fund Consultative Committee, who I should say Kate is on that committee as well, I guess as an applied economist, I've been looking at what is the role of government, and we certainly don't want to just protect the status quo, and we don't want to make decisions for the farmers. So in my view, the role of the government is to facilitate an environment where private sector and industry along the supply chain can search out and seek what is the best thing for them to do, and what is going to make them economically viable and therefore socially and environmentally viable as well. So how can we create, we know that there's change, we know there's changes in geopolitical systems that's going to cause changes in prices and volatility of prices. We've got a changing climate. We need to be able to deal with change, and change is scary for a lot of people. Negative change is scary for everyone, but sometimes change can be hard work and scary. So I think the role of government is to take out that scariness and the fearfulness of that environment, so that, and provide the information, the networks, make sure the support services are there so that a grower can work out for themselves, okay, I am drought resilient, or maybe I'm not. This is the areas that I'm not drought resilient, and I have got help. I know where to go to get the information I need, to get the support I need. I'm linked up with my community. I know who to talk with, and I feel safe. And to be, and not just safe to stay doing what we are doing, but safe to restructure if I need to, adapt if I need to, transform if I need to. And it's exciting, and there's potential in that, rather than scary, I'm overwhelmed, I don't know what to do. So I guess that's where I've come from as an economist on the committee, is to say, how can we create that environment to get a vibrant, adaptive, transformative regional rural Australia?
Thanks, Liz, and you've dovetailed beautifully into a topic that's just come in from two people who are watching this presentation, directed at you, Bruce, and about the crops you've been mentioning. Will they yield sufficiently to keep the population fed, asked Rob Bramley and Felicity Gilbert, and are rural communities appropriately financially rewarded? And a secondary question there is, how much research is actually being done on these native crops and grasses? Are we yet again behind the 8 ball for something that was right in front of our face?
Well, there is a lot of research being done, but it's all recent, as far as I can see. So SCU, Sydney Uni, Melbourne Uni, there are other institutions as well investigating the perennial crops that I talk about. And the farm here is run by Black Duck Foods, which is Aboriginal organisation, and we employ Aboriginal people in the most part. And we're talking with farmers who are wanting to change over to perennial systems. Now, the yield per acre you mentioned before, some of the crops, the yield is comparable. For others, it's much less. But then again, the on costs are very low. If you're not adding water, if you're not adding fertiliser and a pesticide, you're not ploughing, you're reducing the on cost. It is still possible to make a profit on those plants. Kangaroo grass, for instance, is selling at $1,000 a kilogram at the moment. There are many farmers doing very well out of it. And that will change over time as more and more people grow it, of course, and our harvesting and winnowing systems get better. The price is going to come down to comparable to other crops. But there is research being done, and it's, it would be ridiculous to transform straight away to these across the whole agricultural land of Australia, because we need to continue providing food. We don't want to run off hairy-scary with a new idea as if it's the Holy Grail. We have to test it and we have to learn about it. But the people who are doing this already are those people where their farms have failed. The agricultural system that they had employed has failed them. Their soil is nearly dead. They're suffering from shortage of water. So to begin growing perennial grains on those properties is really sensible. And the people who have done it, what they refer to most frequently is, I'm making money for the first time in 35 years and I'm working less.
If I can go to Kate, your area of expertise is in natural resource management. Is there much talk about those kind of perennial grains and native grasses? And is this one of the areas where we're going to see this thing we've talked about for the last day and a half, and I'm sure we'll talk about for the next day and a half, a convergence, a breaking down of silos, a sharing of knowledge that sometimes we haven't been so open to do in the past, forced by the issue of creating resilience to drought?
There's so much to talk about, and I'm going to be a little bit of a politician and answer a bigger question and then come back to yours, if I might.
You're
because
welcome.
Thank you, because I do feel, giving my personal response to experience of drought, I haven't really captured what I see as the resilience element. And I did want to say a big thank you to Liz, because she really managed to sum up the triple bottom line approach that we've tried to capture in the Future Drought Fund plan and programs, and just how important that is, because you can't do one without the other. And I think it was Catherine Marriott who sent through a comment today or yesterday about the larger complex system that we work within. And that to me is fundamentally what natural resource management is about, and the area that I work in with people across the country and organisations across the country, is it's understanding that you can't take one little bit of the system because it's all connected, which is pretty obvious when you're running a farm, or when you're a traditional owner managing country, or whether you're managing a national park somewhere. It's all connected. And the people, the environment, and obviously the economy and all that relies upon it. So for me, I would like to go back to the resilience principles that informed us as a committee, that come from a whole lot of fantastic work done internationally about, well, what does resilience actually look like? And sometimes they can seem a little bit conceptual, but they end up being very practical and real about how we do this and how we do this together. And they are things like diversity and diversifying. So that idea that whether it's as a farm and your farming systems and your products, or whether it's diversification and having that diversity and biodiversity in the environment, or whether it's a country's economy, as we've seen, diversity is just really fundamental. And I think that then means diversity of the people who are engaged and involved in all of this. I think being able to respond quickly to disturbance is a really good one, that type feedback loops. And that's something that was really interesting when we look at what's come through from the hubs and others. And then there's another really fundamental principle, which is reserves. So whether that's your money in the bank as a farming enterprise, whether that's seed banks, or whether that's having extra out there in the environment so that if we lose some, the rest is okay, whether it's extra feed for your stock, whether it's extra knowledge, such as what we're going to build with the hubs. And all of that is really fundamental. Then the learning, innovation, and the social capital, which is also for me a part of what the hubs are about. And that comes through in all resilience, in the resilience principles and how we apply them. So we all have to be able to learn, and we have to be able to learn together, and we have to be able to innovate and build those connections and social capital. So for me, that can be applied as an individual. It can be applied as a knowledge and adoption or innovation hub. It can be applied as a country. All of it is really relevant, and that's what's helped inform all of what we're trying to do. So going back to that, I think that also picks up a few points that have come out. And once again, hats off to Anne Polina. I saw that she got a lot of response in the comments today, and some of her comments around collective wisdom, which I think is really important. And I think that does go to the question you asked me about Bruce and what Bruce is talking about, and the fact that we have to acknowledge that wisdom and knowledge sits in many, many places and comes in many forms. It's not just from science or research, and there are different ways that we can work with those and bring them together. And also I wanted to pull upon the scale issue, because this is where I think when we start tussling with, okay, is using native grains going to be sufficient? How do we do that to scale? How do we produce enough? How do we roll that out? All of those things come to another point that's really fundamental for us as natural resource management practitioners, and that is that it's not just about an individual, whether that's an individual farm. That system sits within a much bigger system, whether that farm sits within an industry or whether it sits within a catchment or a bioregion, as Anne was saying. It's all part of something bigger, and we have to understand those interactions to be able to make this work. The stuff that Bruce is talking about is really relevant to all the conversations that have been happening around restoration of pastoral lands and farming lands and conservation areas, and how we do that well. So perennials, yes, people talk about that a lot, and we heard from the WA mob about no-till farming and precision ag, which is another example of not exposing our soils. And I do want to say, I think farming in Australia is sometimes under acknowledged for the adaptation that it has achieved. There's so much adaptation that our farmers have gone through, and there was a great report done by Neil Hughes, I think it was, in ABARES, who looked at productivity and climate change and showed how much worse climate change impacts would have been upon productivity, particularly on those cropping areas in Western Australia that people are talking about, but also Victoria, if we hadn't have actually had that process of improvement and adaptation happening by farmers, we would have seen a far more significant impact. So for me, let's also acknowledge how much great stuff is happening, how much adaptation has happened, how, though Bruce talks about the dust storms, when you look at the stats too around loss of soil through wind erosion, we've actually done a remarkable job. We have improved. It's not good enough, I agree, but we have made big differences. And that's through changes in farming practices and natural resource management as well. So I've thrown a whole lot in there. I'm very sorry about that. I think you'll find that all three of us have so much to say, and it's a really complex area. But yes, Bruce is also doing what I think must be done, which is taking us beyond talking about drought and saying, you know what, there's no such thing as drought in Australia. This is the way it is, and this is how we manage for it. And that includes us having the capacity to go back to old knowledge, as well as seeking new knowledge and innovation and bringing that together so that it becomes something useful for our farmers, but therefore for us, you know, as a country. And I think there's something very valuable. And it was just great today, by the way, with the hubs, seeing that acknowledgement and connection of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples. It just felt like we were making progress.
There has been no collusion here, because I was about to ask you all if you could all think about this and jump in. One thing that has struck me is not what we say, but how we say it. The particular words we use to apply it. As you said, Bruce has touched on this, the difference between saying climate change in a cold way and talking about the seasons. It seems that conversation means much more than talking, because we've got to talk to each other. How about practical ways of changing the way we think and talk? And is it a matter of everybody having to change, or some people having to change a little bit more? Going to Bruce's point, you know, that we've had farming practices that were applied to a landscape that really didn't want them applied to. Bruce, to you, the way we talk about these things, you've already sort of addressed that, I guess, by saying it's not drought, it's just the way it is. Is that a huge hurdle for many people to get over?
I don't think it is. I think we just have to understand our country and treat her for what she is, not pretend that she's someone else and demand that she fit our expectations. Australia is what it is, and it has been successfully used as a food bowl for 120,000 years, or some people say 65,000 years. It doesn't really matter. It's a long time, and it's sustainable. But sustainability is all the go, and people want to talk about it. But I hope they talk about it politely. You know, sometimes environmentalists see the farmer as their enemy, and I think the farmer and the environmentalist are natural friends. And the conversation we have together has to be polite. When we dig trenches and hurl grenades at each other from those trenches, conversation stops or becomes very truncated. We need to have an all-embracing conversation, be polite and be patient. Change takes a long time. And I think the evidence that Australians want to change is all around us. It's not going to take much talking, I don't think, to substantially change the way we treat the soil in this country. Just one more little thing that I didn't mention before is when after the bushfires and the canopy around this farm and across the farm was opened up, we suddenly got harvestable grasses in the forest. And I think that's something we need to look at. The old people used to do it, and it was made explicit to me after the fires. After the first rain, suddenly we had grass where we've never had grass before. And it's something to look at. We might be able to apply it to farms. We could probably certainly apply it to national parks, which would mean a whole re-evaluation of how we treat Mother Earth and national parks. And I don't want to alarm people who love national parks. It's just that they may look a little different in the future.
That's very interesting, being truly present. Liz, Kate, have you noticed a change in the way the conversation is going, or are there ways you'd like to see the way that conversation goes, the words we use and how we use them? Liz?
Me first? Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do think there's a change. And I think when you see the different speakers that we've had today, incredibly inspirational and inclusive. And it's really important to be inclusive of all peoples, all ages, all diversities, all background, all genders. And I think we're including that inclusivity, being more inclusive in that way as well. And I think it's about, I think there was a comment on the chat about natural capital and protecting natural capital. It's a sense of stewardship. We're not here to make money. This is a lifestyle. We need to have stewardship of the land. We need to make money as well, but we need to live in a community, in a thriving community. So I think there's a huge, as a committee too, we're looking at ways, especially through ecosystem services, that we see natural capital as part of the land, as stewardship, but potential income stream as well. And I think as we look towards net zero emissions, we're going to have huge options for building our natural capital in the ag system, and I think that's coming. It may not become through a official government carbon market. I suspect it will be industry led, but I'd love to see that we can be proactive through the hubs to. I would hate to see big blocks of trees being built like we had the plantations where big paddocks and farms were taken up, which is by trees, which was no good for social capital and for the communities. But there's a huge opportunity. I mean, we've gone a long way in NRM and protecting our assets through the various National Land Care Program and its in its different forms. And I think we're protecting, in a way, really high value assets, but I think we've got a long way of protecting what we would see as the lower value assets, but they're still incredibly valuable along our creek beds and the social the natural capital on our farms. And if we can be engaging, I guess, with mining companies that are making huge amounts of money at the moment, and planning on our farm and planning on a landscape scale, looking at innovative ways of where do we want to have trees and biodiversity and strong ecosystems, where don't we want it, and how can we plan for it, given that I think we've got a huge, I think as there's going to be a huge demand for storing capital in that way. And I think we can, I'm really excited about the opportunities in Australia to make big headways in NRM and natural capital, but I think we have to be really careful how we do it and plan for it and be proactive in it. And I think I've taken the conversation in a different direction. Kate,
no, this is where the conversation, we are meandering. There are undulations. A lot of our country is flat and there are a lot of straight lines, but there are also lots of hills as well. It strikes me that also we live in a digital age, but we all know what happens when the digital television signal breaks up. It goes up in all those little squares and it doesn't make a big picture. A lot of what I've been hearing as a layperson is we've got a lot of those squares, we've got a lot of that detail, but the picture goes a bit fuzzy at times, if it's even a picture at all. Do we, to use a sort of hop-in kind of analogy, do we all need to basically refresh? Sorry to lob you a curveball, Kate. Do you want to pick that one up?
Oh, no, I love it. I love curveballs, but also if you want someone who's meandering, that's me, as my colleagues can tell you. So I'm in the right place quite clearly. And there's so much I want to respond to as usual. Look, one of the things I do want to say is I think we can become more sophisticated about our conversation. When you were talking, so I'm going to pick up several streams. One is about the language. We need to be able to talk about and deal with uncertainty and unpredictability. So drought sits within this bigger picture, as we've all said, and we need to have the capacity, whether it's as businesses, individuals, regions and country, how is it and what do we need to be able to do to manage for uncertainty and unpredictability and for risk. And I noticed someone put up something in the chat about insurance. That's a classic example about that. And I think Liz mentioned the issue of international markets, as well as whether it is going to rain or not. So that picks up a big piece. And I think that takes us further in our conversation than just drought, if we can do that. Likewise, I think the issue about pathways and the language around pathways is really good, because then we're learning. I think sometimes we can be really naive and assume more information is just a good thing and that creates behaviour change and that's sufficient. It's not. We all know that. We know that from all sorts of different things about what we do, where we know it's not right for us, but we will still eat that or smoke that or whatever it might be. That's talking from a very individual level, but we need to be very clear about what our assumptions are in this space. And I think the language, as you say, when we unpack that, can help us with that. So, the assumption that just provide more information and then we'll be able to do a better job with drought resilience is not necessarily correct. So we need to understand more about opportunities and potential and pathways that are available for us. And we need to be able to do that together, because there are choices we can make as individuals, but then there are ones that we need to do collectively. So we need to have that language, I think, about the pathways forward. There is never going to be one for everyone. And it was so good to see that coming through with the hubs, because the whole point was that place-based idea. There is never one solution or one answer for everyone. It has to be worked out together. So that then brings us to the natural capital conversation. And look, there's a lot happening in this space, and the Australian government is also doing some interesting things outside of the Future Drought Fund in this space, as are private companies and banks and regional NRM organisations. So whether it's the Carbon Plus Biodiversity trials that are being run at the moment, funded from the Australian government, and it's been run with 6 regional NRMs around the country, that's a great example at looking how you can whether you can monetize these things and create an additional income stream. That won't be as sufficient in and of itself, but it will be about diversifying funding sources for farmers, and also putting a value on something that we as a country, as a society, want to maintain. And that's a really important element as well. There's reef credits that Terrain NRM have been involved in doing with reef, green collar. That is another interesting example. And there's all sorts of great natural capital work happening. I think Perth NRM have a great process happening with some farmers out west as well about being able to measure natural capital. So look, it's a busy space right now. So one hopes there is something in it. And part of what we need to do is make sure we can connect up across those things. One more point, though, about that, and this goes to Liz's point about, monocultural plantations being put in the wrong spot and the impact they can have on agriculture, on communities and on the environment. We really need to, and we've known this for a long time, have ways of also not dictating to people what their decisions are, but being able to help manage what the collective impacts might be of decisions and, for example, of markets. So the managed investment scheme work that happened where we saw blue gum plantations end up taking away water from catchment systems when they were put in the wrong place, or really deteriorating as far as communities, taking away from communities, etc. There was all sorts of things that we learned from those sorts of instances. So for us, regional NRM plans are a really good way of saying, you've got this whole area, this farm or this reserve or this water system, this patch of soil, all of that is connected and is impacted by what we do elsewhere. So how do we help make sure that you don't have perverse or negative outcomes coming through from some of these other things? So let's say lots of international money wants to go into plantations for carbon. How do we make sure that we don't end up with that creating all these other impacts? And likewise, opportunities, we can look at these things and say, where are there fantastic opportunities, particularly if we know what's likely to happen? What are the climate projections saying? What might happen in 10 or 20 years? That doesn't always just become a negative. That might be something, an opportunity as to what we can do as well. So for me, this is part of that bigger discussion too about, yes, we can talk about farm, but that farm works within a much bigger system. So what do we need to help not just throw this responsibility to the individual? What do we need to have that collective discussion? And it might be new products and markets for ecosystem services that fit within international processes. It might be regional NRM plans and understanding how you don't want to have a negative impact because something's done here, you don't want it to impact badly upon these areas. All of those sorts of things, and that fits within that broader discussion about understanding what our options are and what our potential pathways are, which also can help bring us together to have that conversation and how we do that.
Thanks,
I
Kate.
meandered. How did that go to meander?
And beautifully so. That was Dr. Kate Andrews, with her Dr. Liz Peterson and Enterprise Professor Bruce Pascoe, also a farmer and an author, part of this panel discussion. We're about halfway through. We're going to get directly to the questions which are flooding in full spate. But I just want to chuck this one in, and you've got to draw the line somewhere. And I don't want to wander off into other topics, but we all know that many of the lines drawn in terms of jurisdictions are completely arbitrary and are based on somebody else's idea of where they should be. Already, Bruce, you touched upon your country straddles one border, and there are other things shared in that area as well. What kind of football you play and all that kind of thing. I know we have to draw the line. How do we connect people so that something on one side of a boundary is passed on to people on the other? We tend to look away from our borders sometimes, I think. Bruce, I mean, you're sort of in border country there. I mean, I'm guessing in day-to-day life people do that, but when you get structures imposed or placed rather, particularly from government, it can become a little bit, no, that's Victoria, no, this is New South Wales.
We tend to ignore it pretty much. The government has us in a border bubble, and that's a pretty accurate reflection of how we behave. There's AFL and NRL down this way, but in the border region, it tends to be a blend of the two, combined with soccer as well. That's basically how we behave. And I like to, go back to pre-colonial times when Aboriginal people were combining, say, to do a burn. They would communicate their desire to do this burn or their idea of when it should take place over an incredibly wide area, crossing all sorts of language boundaries. And those boundaries were real. Those language boundaries were quite tight. There was always a corridor there which could be shared, but they were real boundaries. But Aboriginal people communicated across those boundaries using song lines and messengers so that the burn could take place, but not disadvantage other people in the district. And the same with the harvest. We will all come and harvest your grain or your tubers, and when it's your time, we will come and see you. And it was, I don't think we need to be too hidebound by the borders in place. And I used to live on the Murray River border for a short period of time too, and the same thing took place there. And farmers were not oblivious to the border, but behaved liberally within it, you'd have to say.
Liz, Kate, any views on whether we should be a bit agnostic when it comes to set borders, or we should bend a little?
Kate, did you want to start?
Just that it's damned obvious. I mean, I remember having a meeting, one of my first meetings in Birdsville with work I was doing years ago, and people saying, well, since when has a pig ever stopped at a state border? And when does the water stop flowing across a state border? I mean, of course, you have to find ways to manage across borders. And that's where I think, and once again, it sounds conceptual, but in practice, it makes a difference when you're out there aerial shooting a feral animal. And that is that we as organisations, whether it's regional NRM organisations, whether it's state agencies, whether it's land care groups, et cetera, of course we all work to cooperate. And we have some great alliances in regional NRM, the regional NRM sector, where we work across, there's this tri-state alliance for the Murray-Darling Basin with about 7 regional NRM bodies who do great stuff and collaborate across. Really good examples there. Rangelands Alliance, who work across borders. And then there are individual times when people get together and say, we're a lot more effective if we actually manage this across our borders. So I think you'll find that people do a lot of that in spite of those borders being there. But it does bring in that question about the scaling issue as well. For us to be effective in doing the sorts of work we need to do, we need to be able to work from a paddock scale right up into a cross-border state scale as appropriate for the issue we're dealing with. So, whether it's collectives of farmers working together for carbon production or for fighting a certain weed and working across their borders to fight the weed, or whether it's examples of great corridor and connectivity restoration of our landscapes through Gondwana Link, for example, and some of the work Greening Australia does, or others within the sector do. There's so many examples out there where Australians just get on with it and don't let these things get in the way. And that's where I think having good social capital becomes important too, that we can talk to our neighbours about how we're managing this weed, or we can talk across the border and make these things happen. So look, to me, it's just grist for the mill and stuff we've been doing decades and decades. And it becomes very specific because you don't want to have to stop at the border when you're out killing pigs.
Liz, anything to add to that?
Yeah, look, I completely agree with what Bruce and Kate have been saying. And I think, and we need to manage across borders, absolutely. It becomes difficult. It's a complex environment that we're working in. And sometimes it's easier just to say, we need to put a box around what we're doing to be able to cope with it. And sometimes I think there's a place for doing that. And it's not just geographical borders, I guess. It's different sectors that we might research versus extension, or it might be different commodities. And sometimes, and we really have to dig down, especially when we've been talking about the importance of place-based research and adoption and innovation. But then to make sure we're continuously coming out, watching what our neighbours are doing, learning what we're doing, and then coming in, how does it affect us? But then continually looking at the brighter picture. And I think I've been really excited about what the hubs are doing, and that it's not that linear, as Kate mentioned in a chat, it's not just linear progression between research and implementation, but we're looking at across sectors and looking at the broader landscape. And then if the 2 different hubs in which WA is in and are talking, and then so it's collaboration within the hubs, but then collaboration across hubs, and we're really keen for that to be really strong in forums like this. And they're not just across the hubs, but they're different programs that the Future Drought Fund has, and the other programs outside the Future Drought Fund. I think that's where we're going to get the step change, is if we can be broad and go across borders, but very mindful that sometimes then we need to come in and say, what does it mean for us? And it's not an easy thing.
Thanks, Liz. I must say, Bruce, using that wonderful phrase, the district, warmed the cockles of my heart, because the district, nobody drew a line really, but everybody knows what the district means in many, many ways. Okay, I'm going to put you three on notice. In about half an hour or so, as we come to the end of this panel, I'm going to go round the panel and ask you for an answer to the question, what does a drought resilient future look like? So I'll just put you on notice there. But now we're going to go to questions from you. I've already integrated some of the comments you've been making, and my goodness, it's been going off in the comment section as well as Q&A. So let's start with a question from Nicole Reichelt. It's to the whole panel. So this is for all of you, Bruce, Kate and Liz. Can you talk to drought adaptation and resilience, and could it be put into practice by considering different farm business models, such as share farming, cooperatives, aggregating ecosystems? So the organisation of agriculture has to change. It's almost like we have to disassemble it to build it back up again. Is that something that is possible, viable? What do you think? I see Liz nodding there. Liz, can you kick us off?
Yeah, it's a great question. And absolutely, when we're talking about adaptation and transformation, we're not just talking about land use. We're talking across the board in various parts of the agricultural system. So one of them is in business structures, and absolutely, I think there's fantastic opportunities for share farming, for cooperatives, and I think there is an opportunity to try different things and have a diversity of different things. It's not like we have to change from this system to that system to be drought resilient, but I think we certainly need to look at the different models and how it works in different regions, and different things will work for different regions. But we have discussed this specifically at the committee, and we would love to foster that kind of adaptation transformation on how businesses run.
Kate, have you anything to say about that? The organisation of agriculture. I mean, it seems we're going to have to chew gum, walk, juggle, and many other things at the same time.
But we have forever. I mean, I always find it really amusing when people start talking about co-ops or collectives, because if you go back over the history of agriculture in Australia, I mean, my God, we've had some, I mean, sure, we've had some very visible failures, but we've had some incredibly long-running successful co-ops and collectives that have been about giving the power to the members, farmers, and giving the benefit back to them. And we can use old models for new things, such as in the carbon space. You know, it doesn't have to be done through a middle person necessarily. Perhaps we can help create better equity. And we haven't talked about this issue of equity in this process as well, about who can be a part of this, and how do we ensure that we're not excluding people or making life tougher for some than others. So there's all of those things. And I think I really love this question, because it does so clearly show that building resilience and innovation is about so much more than just, as Liz said, the land management stuff. But sometimes we've got answers right there in front of us that we're not looking at, and sometimes we need to do wholly new things and explore with those wholly new things. So as you can see, both Liz and I get overexcited about all of this stuff, but there's so much there and so much to talk about.
I'm just wondering, Bruce, is changing the organisation of agriculture in many ways has the danger potentially of fiddling with structures when some more fundamental issues need to be addressed here and now, clear and present danger, etc.
No, I agree with Kate. I think we've had some very flexible farming models in this country and elsewhere before. You know, the dairy cooperatives, the butter factories, they were all kind of farm socialism in a way. And, you know, you daren't call it that, but basically that's what it was. And we've done that. But one of the things I wanted to mention, which is sort of veering away from your question a little, is that I visited a property recently, and we were there to harvest grass, but the property had a fence that was 7 foot high, to keep out kangaroos. And it was an incredibly expensive fence and wasn't working because trees were falling down across it. Admittedly, this was during bushfire times, and the roos were finding their way back into the paddock. But it's been said before by others. But if we're going to graze kangaroos, why don't we eat them? And, you know, I've just written another piece about the difficulty of the kangaroo because it bounces. It doesn't walk or run, it bounces. And that seems to be the impediment, apart from it being on the coat of arms, of course. But here is a low-fat source of protein, and it is a very cute animal, but no cuter than a Jersey calf or a Hereford calf. So why aren't we eating an animal which is largely pest-free when it's ranged on areas where cattle aren't, low-fat and very adaptive to Australian drought conditions? Why aren't we utilising that meat resource? Because it doesn't look enough like British farming? You know, and that adaptivity is that Kate was talking about comes in here, because if you say that kangaroos range across a bigger parcel of land than a normal private holding, then why not cooperate? Why not have kangaroo harvests where people are rewarded for either the size of their property or the preponderance of kangaroos upon them? Or, you know, we can hide money in the Bahamas. Surely we can come up with a way of dividing funds that way. And we get rid of hard-hoofed animals, not completely, but in some circumstances where farmers choose to go down this path. And we look after our ground better, and we don't have to apply so many pesticides and chemicals, and nor do we have to bemoan lack of rain, because kangaroos are used to all that. And I think that the conversation around that would be fascinating. And as long as we could be polite and realistic and caring of the person on the other side of the table, I think that would be a fascinating argument, as long as people don't start banging the table and throwing out the furniture.
Can I add something?
So you could always add something, Kate.
Oh, can I? That's you might. We'll see how we go over the next 40 minutes or so. Look, I just want to jump in there, Bruce, and say, yes. This is a conversation we've been having for decades. I've been around that long. And look, I think the barriers are more than just the coat of arms issue, but you'll be glad to know there's so many champions out there looking at how do we, in fact, help create a kangaroo industry beyond where we have. As someone who lived in West Queensland for years, you know, the kangaroo industry was very much part of what happened. And I think this is where we can bring in a number of things too, because this is where what can be a problem becomes an opportunity. So kangaroos are seen as an issue, as you'll be aware, whether it's animal welfare issue with kangaroos dying in the drought, or the impact that they have upon pasture and grazing pressure, which is something that we hear regularly, particularly with regards to drought, and hence the exclusion fencing approach. So, you know, you have this problem, turn it into a solution and opportunity. There are some great champions out there, and I think there's even a national task force on kangaroo management who were looking at, well, how do we do this and manage this? And it's something that happened with goats. I remember when we used to just fund killing goats, and then goats became a source of income for people. I think very much the same with farmers and with kangaroos. And I think this also brings me to a point that we often don't bring up, and that's that issue of imagination. How do we, as individuals, but also more collectively, how do we reimagine some of these things? And sometimes they're staring us in the face. Sometimes perhaps they're a little bit more elusive. But imagination becomes a really important part of this, and reframing some of these things. And I think personally, I love a good kangaroo steak, and I do think this is one of those areas where there's so much that we could do. I see someone says they fluctuate with climate variability. They do. I've got a whole lot more in my paddock at the moment. They're enjoying the kangaroo grass that came up after the fire. But there are ways, particularly with Colleen and how you manage that business model, that you could in fact end up with a very beneficial industry for people that is farming in a very, very different way. So thank you, Bruce, for bringing that up.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I came to live in Australia from the UK in 1988. And when I first came to this country on holiday in the 80s, having a kangaroo steak was exotic. Mm-hmm. Then it became niche, and now it's sort of stalled. It's still there, but you have to look for it. Whereas you got lamb, beef, pork. Yeah. And is it, I wonder what you reckon, Liz, is it just breaking past that cuteness thing? And as Bruce said, all animals are cute. Well, most animals are cute. And that's a business issue?
Sorry, is that was that to me? I'll jump in. Yeah. I think and I think there were problems. Look, this is not my area of specialty, but I think there were problems.
But you're a consumer though, aren't you?
I'm a consumer. That's right.
Yeah.
And look, it's a red meat, and I'd be keen, but I think if we're dealing with drought resilience, often the Australian market is quite small, and for something to grow, it needs to develop an international market would be if we want to get a big market. So I think it's about how it's marketed overseas, and I think if we could invest in getting kangaroo meat as clean and green, good for the environment meat, rather than they're eating their local pets or something, then I think we've got a real opportunity there.
It always comes back to Skippy. Bruce, got a question directed to you from Alex van der Meer Simo, who says, in your argument that this is the way it is, as you said right at the beginning here, I believe you've also said that Australia is sustainable. Alex asks, however, there's plenty of evidence that shows that Australia's biodiversity is under increased threat and has overall declined. He's asking, how can we match those two things, that threat and this is the way it is?
Well, the biodiversity that is diminishing now was inherited from Aboriginal people. So the biodiversity that we knew in 1780 was received from Aboriginal people and received from the continent herself. So what has happened in the past has to have something to do with our methods. And we're looking at bandicoots at the moment. And, I'm going to hold up a couple of books that I'm reading at the moment. Entangled Life by Sheldrake and Soil by Matthew Evans, about soil building. And hard-hoofed animals are really hard on the earth, and strip grazing can ameliorate that to a certain extent. But the other thing is bandicoots. And what we've done by cropping pastures right down to the ground is eradicate home for small mammals. And those small mammals in the Australian landscape, they were the tillers, they were the fertilisers, the burrowers, the redistribution of nutrients. And there are a few of us down here looking at ways of reintroducing bandicoots, not because they're cute, but they were an incredible source of protein and are delicious. I shouldn't know that, should I? But the introduction of bandicoots is said by plenty of soil scientists to be a really positive thing in the Australian landscape. And look, can I just also bring in there, completely off the subject, and I apologise for it, but so many of the first settlers on the country, I'm talking about Europeans, talked about how damp the country was. how they couldn't keep a pair of socks dry throughout the day because the grass was wet. Now, those descriptions that those people wrote down were about plants like orchids and murnong and kangaroo grass growing through moss. Now, as soon as the sheep came, those same settlers said the moss disappeared and the dew stopped. So if we look at that vegetation that high above our soil and look after that and don't let it get down to there, then I think our soil health will increase. How do we go about doing that? Well, kangaroos is one of the ways, because they can't physically crop right down to the soil. I am talking about my country, Yuin country. This is my experience of it. People from other country might have other understandings of what kangaroos will and won't do, but my experience is that kangaroos look after the soil much better than a beast.
As Jay Kennedy told us just before lunchtime, all things come from country, and there's a very good example of that. A question about markets now. So perhaps we should. This might be specifically for Liz. Drought resilience and change. It comes from Elizabeth Coonan. Drought resilience and changes in land management and food products will require changes in markets, and all that means. How do we change the conversations about drought across the supply chain through to the consumers, which I guess is another way of saying, how do you get us folk in the towns and cities to actually pay attention to the outcomes of what you're trying to achieve in the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a balance between what is sustainable and what we can grow in Australia and what consumers are demanding in Australia and as a small market, very importantly overseas. But overseas we have a huge market and a hugely diverse market. So I guess we've created the market for the goods that for the commodities that we've traditionally grown and grown well. And we've ridden on the sheep's back largely in that, and we might have to change how we're doing. And then it's proactive about developing the different markets that, or the markets I suspect largely are there, but we have to develop the supply chains and the knowledge and the transfers and the opportunities to supply to those markets. And I think this is part of drought resilience and risk management, that we shouldn't be relying on the markets that we have already. And I think that if there was a comment I saw about COVID, and that is about risk management. So we've been highly reliant on one large importing country, China, for so long. And that has served us well and been very profitable. But I think given given COVID, it goes to show that we can't just be reliant on what we have already done. We have to have a diversity of markets to be resilient, and it's about risk management. So food security isn't about about producing everything that we eat. It's about having a diverse range of countries from which we import. So if we have a drought, another country has a drought, that's okay. We can import what we need from various other places if needs be. And I think that's the same for our export markets, that we can't be reliant on certain export markets. That's something like COVID comes up and we are in strife. So we need a range of diversity of markets. So if someone doesn't want to import a kangaroo from one country, then we've got other options to go to. So I think it's about risk management, and it's about being proactive about, okay, if we're finding that our system, as we adapt and transform, we're producing different things, then we go to the consumers that are becoming more and more discerning, and especially market our produce. There's a comment I know about getting extra price premiums for what might be considered clean and green, or where we've been looking after our natural capital, marketing our produce, being quite proactive where we're going. There's there's so many countries out there with different demands. I don't think we need to be fearful of a change in marketing, except we just see this as an opportunity to be drought resilient, that we have a number of options to go to. We're not just reliant on our traditional markets.
I know as an aside, the UN are looking at much more depth in labelling of food so that you do find out not only it's sustainably farmed, but how sustainably farmed. So we look past the marketing catalogue from the supermarket that's telling us they're greener than ever this week. Here's a question which I'll throw to all of you, and it's a beauty, I think, from Paul McDonald. Where do our future farmers fit in all of this, in this kind of discussion? Where do they fit? Because our minds are still being trained and being educated in basically a European way, strongly attached to the animals that were introduced after 1788. That's a huge question. Does it start on the farm itself? Does it start in the agricultural colleges? Or does it start in the conversations in the hubs that then ripple out into the community? Kate, can you start with that one? It's a big one.
It's huge. Thanks, Paul. Look, I actually, what I'd like to do is connect that back to some of the comments Liz was making. Because the way you framed your question to Liz was about how we connect with consumers so that they understand what we're trying to sell, or new markets. I actually think in Australia, with our reliance upon international markets, that there's probably a pull change that is happening, and that is going to happen more, which relates to your point about not just the UN, but major corporates, as well as trading blocs and countries that are requiring accountability around, let's just call it sustainability for simplicity's sake, but obviously there's a lot in that. And how that fits in the drought resilience picture is making sure that we are not eroding our natural capital when we are in drought. So for us, and by the way, that's not just about premium markets, that's about just maintaining access to markets as well. So we do have a huge pull happening there, and I think that's one that will also influence where our farmers come from, our future farmers and what they're doing. So there's that interaction that's going to become really important. And to be honest, I think we see great examples of young farmers who are very aware of the direction that the international consumer is heading, whether it's McDonald's and sustainable beef, or whether it's Nestle and wanting, to be picking up on those things, or whether it is actually the EU and what they did with our canola crops in WA, where we had to be able to show footprint. And because of the innovation and capacity of canola growers in WA, they were prepared for that. So part of this is also understanding the trends and being able to respond to that. And that, I think, having some of our switched on farmers and industries become really, really important. The other thing I do want to say is I think we'll redefine what being a farmer is. And we're seeing that already with stewardship. I remember 25 years ago talking to a farmer about stewardship and things like, you're producing biodiversity as well as food and fibre was seen as pretty outrageous. Whereas now I think people are realising that agriculture and land management is about so much more. It's about what Bruce is talking about. It's about those natural capital markets, etc. So I think we will see that as a redefinition of what being a farmer is. And if you have people in cities who want to pay to make sure that there are bandicoots out there, for example, drawing upon Bruce's comments, then that becomes part of what you produce as a farmer, as well as the food and fibre. So for me, there's a lot happening there. Look, how we bring that along, I think there's a really big conversation to have there, and it would be so exciting within the context of the Future Drought Fund to have that, whether it's in our resilience leadership work or our networks work or our working with young people to try and ensure that they see those opportunities and can create those opportunities or take advantage of them. So I feel like I've been quite high level, but it's a great so much in there. And Paul, I do think this is where my point about imagination comes in as well, and being able to look at things differently, just as Bruce has brought to the table in our conversation today, or as Liz has with regards business models, being able to reimagine those things, or find things that from older times, bring that to the table and reinvent what we do as well. And I think it could be really exciting, but I also think we have that control. So we can't manage it all. Anyway, look, I am meandering now, so I'm going to shut up and pass the ball back to someone else. But I would love to have that conversation into more depth.
Before I go to Bruce, because I want to ask him about his experience with up-and-coming farmers, I'm giving you all about a 5-minute warning before we have final thoughts on that big question: what does a drought-resilient future look like? And I'm looking for about 3-4 minutes from each of you when we get to that. But Bruce, in your conversations in your district there, what kind of conversations are the young farmers or wannabe farmers or maybe farmers having with you? Are they plugging themselves in an informal way to what you're doing on your property?
Well, those young would-be farmers or present farmers tend to be very aware and tend to talk much more about their soil and natural habitat than their fathers and grandfathers did. So I find that encouraging. But my main focus is to make sure that Aboriginal people are part of this industry, that instead of having half-baked employment schemes and for Aboriginal people and almost no decent training schemes, that we include Aboriginal people in the economy and make sure that Aboriginal people have access to land, so that Aboriginal people can become farmers or can become food producers, let us say, and that instead of talking endlessly about reconciliation, let's conciliate each other on the farm. And we're trying to do that here. I know that other groups at Narrabri are thinking about doing the same thing. And I just see it as so cost efficient to train people while they're at work. And I've seen so much money wasted by training people for jobs that don't exist. And I think there's a lot of jobs to be had on the land. And I want our community, our Aboriginal community, to have a share of those jobs, to be part of the economy and become part of the nation, instead of what it appears to be in the press, that Aboriginal people are the problem.
Yeah, Karen Crosswaite this morning, as she opened this morning's session, the First Assistant Secretary, talked indeed about this drought resilience actually being, quote, practical reconciliation. It actually delivers in so many ways. I've got one final quick question, which is from Grace Moriuki, and it's: how can or should we manage perverse negative fallouts from cross-boundary systems? It's my lines again. Could the hubs that we've got here, the 8 hubs, be a pilot to demonstrate how we can do this? I mean, the role of the hubs, particularly for the two of you who are on the FDF Consultative Committee, I mean, it's front and centre with you. How far can they go, or should we not even give them any limitations? Liz?
Yeah, it's a really good issue, and we've got to be really careful that we don't have these kind of perverse impacts. And we would have, we would have loved to increase the funding of the hubs, and we're very concerned that if there's areas that are not covered by a hub, that they are really carefully included. And we wanted to have the hubs over the whole of the Australian landscape. So I think that's just something that as we plan, we have to be really, 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 really mindful, and that the hubs are really important, but they have to look beyond their boundaries. If there's people that are not influenced directly by their hub that they are seeking those people, and that if there is also, well, hopefully they'll work together if there is a crossover in the hub. But it's a really great issue, a really great point to raise, and it is an issue, and we really just want to be mindful and careful as we go along.
I guess, Kate, the hubs are always going to be a bit of a work in progress. They need structure, but they're finding their own way and singing their own song.
Yes, which is appropriate because they have to be relevant to their place and people. So that's fine. But I also think I think it's a work in progress too, because there's a cultural change process happening here about how we do this stuff. And part of the hubs was to try and upend some of our more traditional how we do research and how we share knowledge, how we create and share knowledge and then apply it. So, and what that knowledge is, like what is it that we need answers to, and how do we deal, what's actually going to be helpful for us as we create resilience. So we were hoping to upend that model so that it wasn't just a conventional research model, hence you see research isn't in the title of them. And this was really for us about saying, yeah, we have to learn how to do things differently, because it's not just what we're working on, it's how we're working on it that will also make a difference. So this was an important way for us, but it does mean that we have to learn to do these things differently, and that's a bit of a capacity and cultural change process. And to be honest, watching people over the last 2 days, I feel like, people have grabbed that and are trying to run with it, but we have to make sure that we don't revert back to business as usual, but we keep going. And I think that also goes to the point, I think what Grace was trying to get at too wasn't just geographical boundaries, it's system boundaries. And that's where it becomes so important when we are doing the work, with the hubs work and other work, that part of the systems boundary is understanding not just all of those different things that we've all referred to, but the relationship between them. So I think George might have put something in there about kangaroos being integrated into our pastoral management systems. It doesn't become a separate thing. It's the relationship and the relationship between our farming systems and international markets we were just talking about. So for me, that there's that issue, but there's also the issue of how that scales up and understanding how you might get perverse outcomes also between scales, which is why having, for me, regional planning becomes so important for minimising bad outcomes, maximising positive ones. So there are all sorts of things, but working across silos, trying to break down those silos, trying to work across disciplines, trying to work with different forms of knowledge, so that you have farmers at the table, you have Indigenous people and traditional owners at the table who bring different understandings and knowledge. All of those things become a really important way to work across those systems and those potential perverse outcomes. I think this is what Grace was perhaps leading to. I think it can sound all very wanky and conceptual, but when you're actually talking about it, it means that you're not just looking at one crop. And working with one farmer on one crop through a commodity RDC, for example. You're working across different with farming systems or even beyond farming systems. There are all of those sorts of things we need to take into account.
And with that, Kate, I think you've sort of segued into the asking of the question, what does a drought-resilient future look like? I'm going to use a carrot and stick for this. The carrot is afternoon tea is next. The stick is we only have 20 minutes for afternoon tea if we start at hour Eastern time, and we have approximately 6.5 minutes. So in about 2 minutes, give us your final thoughts about a drought-resilient future. Can I start with you, Liz?
Yeah, I'd love to. I guess for me, a drought-resilient future is that the word drought is only used in managing seasonal variability, and it's only used in terms that we have to plan for it and we have to be very careful. I'd love to think that the word drought is never needed to be raised in the media again, in which case we know how to plan for it and manage for it so that in prolonged years when there's not a lot of rainfall, the farming community is resilient, and therefore it doesn't hit the media as a disaster for our ag sector. So, but that's a difficult one, because if it doesn't hit the media, then often it can go by the wayside and we don't have government funding for it and we forget about it, and then we don't become drought resilient. But in terms of planning for it, I'd love it to be that farmers, both at the farm and the community, regional and Australia level, natural assets are protected at all levels across the landscape with biodiversity and are sustainable. We've got social capital, collectiveness, inclusiveness, that economically that we can try new things. We have an innovative, creative ag sector that tries new things, sometimes fails, sometimes succeed, and that's how we change. That are passionate, love being in the community that they live in, and are really hopeful and confident, so that when they look up at the sky and down at the land, they think, let's hope it rains, but if we don't, we're great. We love this. We're really excited. We love being here. We've got a great community. I think that's drought resilience.
Thanks, Liz. To you next, Bruce. After our discussion, what are your major takeouts from the discussion? How do you see a future where we actually are more at one with the land and use it in the way it was meant to be used?
Well, of course, I'm going to talk about perennial crops. So I'm thinking about my own place and how I would like to see more kangaroo grass, more microlina, more redleg, the Australian grasses. I'd like to see us harvesting those more efficiently, but also harvesting several crops out of the same plot, out of the same paddock, because we're also eating orchids off our land as well as tubers, and tubers are very important, and the bandicoot is very important to the tuber. So I would like to see those perennial crops on our land, a diverse system, a multi-crop paddock, and we learn how to harvest within that paddock without damaging the future crop. And we're doing it with the grasses. We find that each of the grasses is a different height and seeds in a different season. So we're able to harvest across that land with machinery, light-footed machinery, and not damage the other crops. That's what we've noticed. And so I'm hoping that my farm looks more like that than like an old broken down beef farm. And I want a lot more Aboriginal people working on it. And I want the people that we've trained up over the last few years, I want to see them on other properties in the district, and I want to see them a natural part of the farming community rather than an aberration. And I'm not interested in reconciliation at all, but I am a conciliator, and because that's conciliation means both parties equal at the table, and that's what I'm looking forward to, a real Australian farming community where Aboriginal people are represented, where our people can make their money without recourse to government, and grow their kids up, educate their kids, and watch from the veranda as their kids take over the farm. That'd be bliss for me.
Nothing better than a good veranda view. Kate Andrews, can you bring us home, please?
Oh, no tall order there, especially after Bruce. Hey, Bruce, I just want to say I had so much beautiful microlina come up in my block after the fire. It was just beautiful stuff. Anyway, look, I want to see. I don't want to see us using the word. Sorry, Bruce.
It just makes wonderful bread.
Does it? See, I didn't. Yeah, okay, we'll have to talk about this offline. Probably.
Recipe swapping offline, please.
Yeah, okay, offline. So what I want to see, both at an individual and broader level, is I want to see an increase in all forms of capital. So for me, us being drought resilience means that we're not just, stopping the decline, we're actually improving matters with the environment, whether it's soils or biodiversity or the quality of our water systems, that's going upwards regardless what's happening with regards to climate. That social capital's improving, that we're building those better connections. Economically, we're more diverse, we have more irons in the fire, so to speak, whether it's on a farm level or you know, as a country, and that we're building our knowledge capital and our capacity, both as communities and individually. We have increased our knowledge and our capacity to deal with uncertainty and unpredictability. So for me, that means we need to know what might be coming. We need to know how it might affect us. We need to know what the options are and what we're going to do about it. And we need to be able to have those systems in place that are in both the public sector and the private sector that help us do that, both individually, me on my little block, or within the region that I'm existing in, or across the country, that we can work out pathways together that we minimise the negative impact upon each other in our country, and we grab opportunities as they arise as we deal with a changing climate.
Dr. Kate Andrews, Bruce Pascoe, Dr. Liz Peterson, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your vision, for answering the questions, and for giving this forum even more energy as we move into its second half. Thank you so much. Thank you particularly for finishing on time, which is a remarkable achievement. We're going to take a 20-minute break, and wherever you are having your afternoon tea, I don't know what you might be having, but I have had it on very good authority that bandicoots are delicious. See you in 20 minutes.